In this episode, we analyze the costumes of Claire Randall Fraser from Outlander Season 1, coming up. Welcome back to another episode of Costume Co. If it's your first time to this channel, I post almost weekly videos where I analyze costumes from some of your favorite TV shows and movies. And if this is something that you're interested in, then consider subscribing and hitting the bell notification icon so you don't miss a thing. In what will be a two-part episode, we look at the costumes of the Outlander protagonist, Claire Randall Fraser, in Season 1 of Outlander. Before we get to that, I thought I'd mention that for any of you Game of Thrones or Westworld fans out there, I'm doing my very first live stream with YouTube creator In Deep Geek. Robert from In Deep Geek has an awesome channel, and we've been planning this collaboration for ages, so I hope you can join us next Thursday, February 15th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Robert's channel. I'm also delighted to welcome back dress historian and material culturist Brenna Barks. Throughout this process, Brenna has generously answered my questions and guided me through this period of Scottish history. I hope that many of you have also found her insights and knowledge as helpful as I have. And I'll leave Brenna's links in the description below, along with a link to my complete interview with her that I've posted on my Facebook page. Sandy Russo from Knitsy Blonde has also returned to answer many of my questions about the knits from the Outlander series. So Sandy, she's not only got extensive first-hand knowledge of many of the knit items in the show, but she also creates many of the accessories using the same materials and techniques as the show. So I'll also leave Sandy's links down below so that you can check all of her knitwear. Warning, there will be spoilers for the entire first season of the Starz series Outlander. Please refrain from leaving spoilery material on future seasons in the comment section below. Thank you. For the next two episodes, we will look at Claire's costumes from 1743 Scotland, and I will get to her 1940s costumes in a future video. So I've had to split this video into two parts. So this really says a lot about how many costumes this character has, because I have never had to do a two-parter for one character for just one season. In fact, there are so many costumes that it's taken me ages to be able to track them all. And even when I think I have it all, I'm like, oh my God, there's another bodice. Costume designer Terry Dresbach stated on her blog that she settled on 4 skirts and 5 bodices that Claire wears regularly in Season 1. And that's outside of her other special occasion dresses like her wedding gown. My initial impression when I first watched Outlander, and I have only a faint memory of it in the book that I'd read almost like 20 years ago, was that Claire has too many clothes. So from a historical point of view, Brenna Barks says, people didn't own that many clothes back then, so Claire's changing as frequently as she does is inaccurate. She would have had several shifts so that they could be washed, but depending on your status, and Claire has nothing in this world but what Colin Mackenzie gives her until she marries Jamie, you might only own one gown. There are funerary records of people having to be buried in their clothes because it being their only suit of clothes, it wasn't even worth trying to resell as it was so tattered and worn. Terry Dresbach and her team made the decision that Claire needed more clothes to further the story along and to also establish the passing of time. So she stated that she achieved this by largely using separates and accessories to make it appear that Claire had more clothes than she did. And as I've mentioned before, Game of Thrones costume designer Michelle Clapton was able to achieve a complete design with no more than 3 costumes for each principal character per season. So Dresbach, she's got a rather lengthy explanation on her blog about what went into this decision. And I'll respect it, even though I don't necessarily agree with the reasoning behind it. So if you want to check that out, I'll leave a link below so that you can see it. And let me say one last thing, that just because I point out historical inaccuracies in the show, it doesn't mean that I haven't enjoyed the show and the costumes immensely. I wouldn't have spent hours and hours of research bringing you this video series if I hadn't. Thing is, with bigger budgets like we've never seen before, cable shows like Outlander are raising the bar higher and higher, and with that, our expectations become greater too. So at the end of the day, it's entertainment, but if it opens up your world just a little bit, like Outlander I think does, then it's all good. I thought a good place to start would be with Claire's underpinnings, or her foundation garment. So when Claire first arrives at Castle Leoch in a state of like her 1940s underdress, Mrs. Fitzgibbons is tasked with finding Claire something appropriate to wear. So as an audience, we get to discover alongside Claire what goes into an 18th century ensemble. And as I mentioned in a previous video, the first garment a woman wears is a linen shift or sark. Since this garment is closest to the skin, a woman might own multiple shifts that would be laundered as needed. Next, a woman would wear a pair of stays, which essentially is a boned bodice and the precursor to the corset that she would put over top of her shift. These ones here are linen with a center back eyelet so that the lacing is done up in the rear. Here are some examples of 18th century stays. So like Claire's, this set of American or European stays lace at the back and are seamed at the center front. These 18th century silk rear lacing stays are Spanish and would have been worn by someone of an upper status. This gorgeous set of stays from England date between 1730 and 1740. The stays are made of silk moire, silk cording, and ribbons with a linen lining. It's from a display at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in California. Here's an example of silk 18th century cord quilted jumps from Augustus auctions. As an undergarment, jumps were a less restrictive alternative to stays because they were less boned or an unboned bodice. The jumps did provide some support but didn't create that conical shape like the stays. In this image, we can see that the bone stays create that conical shape so desired in this period. Next, Mrs. Fitzgibbons adds a bum roll, which is a crescent-shaped pad that exaggerates the silhouette and creates a rear shelf once the skirt is on. The final undergarment is a petticoat, again usually made from linen. Brenna says that in lieu of a bum roll, lower-class women might wear possibly multiple petticoats to keep warm and get the bulk at the hips that was in vogue at the time. The outer petticoat might also denote the name of the skirt. In episode 2, we see Claire's first 18th century look, dressed in a velvet bodice with detachable sleeves and a pleated tartan skirt. The choice of velvet is unusual since silk velvet would have been imported and very expensive, and she's wearing this outfit with some wrist warmers. The sleeves are laced to the bodice with spiral lacing and offset, hand-worked eyelets. Viewer Coco Stardust asked me in the previous video about the use of spiral lacing versus crisscross lacing. Brenna says that I've never seen the crisscross lacing, I think because it would make the arm side too tight for movement, since cross lacing is usually used to tighten things. It could be done, of course, but I've never seen it done in portraits. And I'll add to what Brenna says and mention that the lacing is only done over the shoulders and not at the underarm to allow for greater movement. And the center front bodice, meanwhile, is fastened with what I assume might be hooks and eyes. Still used to this day, especially on women's lingerie, hooks and eyes go back to the medieval period. Here's an example of a hook and eye closure on a late 18th century bodice from Augusta auctions. It's also possible that the bodice is laced on the inside of the bodice, where like in this 18th century dress from Augusta auctions, the linen lining has hand-worked eyelets. The jacket has a little pleated peplum at the back that flares out over her bum roll. This bodice is similar to the French Pierrot, which is a short jacket with just a ruffle or flounce added to the back. One of the most popular aspects of Claire's costumes are her knit mitts, cowls, and capelettes. I touched on this briefly in the last video about how the knits in Outlander are too chunky. Brenna says that the weight of the yarn was entirely too thick. Chunky knits is a thing now, and it is traditionally a thing in Icelandic and a few other Scandinavian Nordic knitting traditions. Scotland in particular is famous for its intricate patterns in thin yarns, Shetland lace, Fair Isle sweater. All require very light yarns and small needles, not to mention that a spinner was judged for years by how fine they could get their wool. And the knitting needles of the time were so small, they were literally called knitting pins, and they basically look like a fine gauge sewing needle, just very, very long. Everything was too bulky, and they were clearly modern interpretations of garments at the time. Lacy and other sorts of mitts were worn, but they weren't that chunky, usually more delicate. Cowls and even scarves were not a thing. Women would have worn shawls and fichus. Here are two examples of Shetland knits discovered on a man's body found at Gunnister in North Maveen in Shetland in the late 17th century. Amazingly, the purse has 3 bands of decorative Fair Isle pattern on the main body. According to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where the gloves and pouch are exhibited, knitting probably came to Shetland from England, as English words were used for the earliest knitting terms. By the beginning of the 18th century, the islanders were trading hosiery in exchange for money and goods from Dutch and German merchants. Knitters manufactured large quantities of coarse woolen stockings and blankets, as well as the finer work upon which their reputation rested. The V&A states that the early knitters produced stockings, caps, and scarves. Sweaters in the Fair Isle style, as we know it today, were not produced until the First World War. So here are 2 caps, also from the Gunnister man, the cap on the left worn by the man, and the one that we see on the right from inside the man's clothing. Both caps are knit in a stocking stitch pattern, 1 row plain and 1 row purl. Of the design team's choice to use heavier knits, Brenna says, "I definitely think it fits with the aesthetic they were going for, if not the historical accuracy." And I'd also read somewhere, I think possibly in an interview, that Terry Dresbach went with the decision to add these knit pieces as a way to keep actor Katrina Baff from freezing to death while shooting on location in Scotland. So historical accuracy aside, Sandy Russo of Knitsy Blonde tells me that all of the knits for the show were made in Scotland by local knitters. This cowl, Sandy says, it is actually knitted. The fur is spun with some yarn and then knitted into a cowl. The animal fur is incorporated with the yarn as it is spun. The fur tends to stick out like Angora does, making a soft, fluffy yarn to work with. And Sandy thinks it's mink, and mink yarn can be found online, but it's very expensive, she says. And like Angora rabbit, the mink isn't harmed in the removal of the hair. Here's a Knitsy Blonde cowl that Sandy created using faux fur. She offers it in a variety of colors, as you can see on the right. And here is another set of mitts that Claire wears. Sandy says that we've jokingly called all the Season 1 knitwear Mrs. Fitz knit bits. The fingerless mitts, or gauntlets, are basically a tube of knitted fabric that slide over the arm and allow the fingers to be free for work. The mitts can be completely fingerless, thumbless, like these ones seen here, or can have thumbs. Here's a studio shot of the bodice with and without the cowl, and it's matched with a chocolate brown woolen skirt. And I'm not certain, but I think that there might be some padding added to the side peplum, either that or it's been turned under. Here's an early sketch that Terry Dresbach made for Claire's Castle Leoch look in episode 2. This very popular costume consists of a brown wool bodice and the same tartan skirt from before. This is the only tartan skirt that Claire wears in season 1. The other skirts are all made from a solid wool fabric. Here's an inspired tartan fabric called Mist and Stone that's produced by GK Textiles Limited that can be purchased by the yard. And like the Outlander tartan, it's made from 100% Australian merino wool, and it's milled in Scotland. So I'll leave a link in the description below for that. The shape of the bodice is similar to the cassequin, which is a derivative of cassock, the French word for jacket. The cassequin is shorter than the caraco, like Gaelis's jacket I spoke about in the last video. The Chocolate Girl, a 1743-45 work by Swiss-French painter Jean-Étienne Léotard, wears a cassequin jacket, petticoat, and apron. Here's an example of this style of bodice from the 1740s. This British bodice is made of silk, and it's on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Here's another stunning bodice from Augustus Auctions. This French blue silk brocade bodice dates from 1750 to 1770. So the space in the center is where the stomacher would be inserted. Here's a good close-up of the bodice. So not unlike the historical samples with cuffs, these have two-piece set-in sleeves that are split. The space in between the opening of the bodice is filled with a stomacher, which is a stiffened and sometimes boned triangular piece. This one appears to have vertical bone channels. In this image, Claire is inserting the stomacher between the stays and the laces, which keep it in place. And I'm not sure if this is the correct method. I have seen other reenactors do the lacing after the stomacher is in position, but it was probably a personal decision. I have a few stomachers to show you. This embroidered whitework linen stomacher is a very early 18th century example from Augusta Auctions, and it dates between 1700 to 1720. Here are two beautifully embroidered silk stomachers. The hand-sewn English stomacher on the left was made between 1730 and 1750 from blue silk taffeta embroidered in colored silk, while the mid-18th century stomacher on the right is American, and both of them have non-functional crisscross lacing detail. The stomacher would be pinned to the lady's stays or to the inside of the bodice to hold it in place. Some stomachers, like these examples here, have silk tabs to help keep the stomacher in place. Claire adds this check shawl, which she's kept in her basket. This knit shrug covers Claire's upper arms and shoulders. Sandy says it's basically a knitted piece of fabric that is folded up and stitched on the sides only to make armholes. This knit is created using super bulky yarn, super big needles, and the garter stitch. Here's a studio shot of the shrug. The color of the yarn has an ombre effect. Here's Sandy's version of the shrug as seen from behind. In this scene, from what I can tell, Claire is wearing the same bodice but with a different stomacher, this one embroidered. It appears that she isn't wearing a shift underneath the bodice, so I'm not sure why that is. Here it is again in episode 3 with the knits added back in, but this time she's wearing another embroidered stomacher. This is a bit of a better shot of it. In episode 5, Claire adds this waffle weave type fichu, I think over the same bodice, but it's always hard to tell in the dimly lit scenes. Fichus are usually triangular shaped, but this one I think is actually a half circle. Here it is again in episode 12. You can see that she tucks it into her bodice between the laces to keep it in place. Here it is again in episode 5, but she's also added this very faint tartan wrap. I wish I had a better look at the shawl, but from what I can tell, it has a faint red pattern over top of the gray-green background. While this looks similar, this is actually a new bodice. It's slightly more olive drab than the other bodice, but also it has almost no peplum. Here's a great close-up so that you can get an idea of what the fabric looks like. The stomacher and laces are also new. This bodice has elbow-length sleeves and just a wee bit of flare. Here's 100% boiled wool fabric in heathered coffee bean brown from Burdick's fabric that would work nicely. Here's a studio shot with another cowl that, according to Sandy, is the most popular item from season 1. Sandy says this is actually what we would call an infinity scarf. It's a long scarf that is joined at the ends to make a large circle. Claire wears hers doubled up, so it appears to be a cowl. She adds, the Claire cowls are basically made from super bulky yarn, held doubled, and then knit on super chunky needles. Just to show you, here is an infinity scarf that I make, shown loose and then doubled, Sandy says. In this sample image from Sandy, you can also see how big the knitting needles are. Sandy says many people are making these shorter, more like a tube, so there's not quite as much bulk. Here's one that I sell. What I did here is knit a piece of fabric that just folds over. This is just called garter stitch, meaning that all you do is knit, no purling. Here is Claire in the same wool bodice from this episode 2 scene. The outfit has been dressed up with the addition of drop earrings and a choker. I think that the choker is made from woven trim. Here's a better look at it. Again, hard to nail down the color because this new stomacher looks brown or maybe burgundy. I think this is the same bodice again in episode 10, in the scene where she slaps Leary. Only thing is that not only does this bodice have this burgundy embroidered stomacher, but also braid. So it's possible that they took the existing bodice from earlier in the season and then adjusted it. And Dresbach says of the collar, I don't remember exactly how this came to be. I remember discussing it with my team, new ways to play with scraps of fabric to make accessories, inspired by using leftover wool from the floor of the mill to make Hugh Monroe's costume. One day, walking by the very talented Emily's work table, I found a square she had made of woven strips. We decided to see if we could make it into a kind of fichu collar. That's what I remember, but it's all a bit foggy. I love this piece, and I believe it. Now, I'll be honest here, I'm not a big fan of this piece. Firstly, I have an aversion to this olive color and how it reads in the scene. And secondly, unlike Gaelis's fairy jacket, which I think was a stroke of genius, in my humble opinion, this looks unfinished. Here's Terry Dresbach's sketch of Claire's surgery costume from July 2013. I think her notes read, striped linen wrap over various skirts, linen chemise. Here Claire wears the final costume in episode 3 and 4. The sleeveless bodice is an asymmetrical overlapping style. She wears this look with a linen apron at Castle Leoch. She wears it again at Lallybroch. Each panel of the bodice is cut in such a way as to create the chevron pattern, and the bodice is cropped right at the natural waistline. The neck and armholes are finished with matching piping, and the shoulders appear to have a contrasting panel. In episode 3, Claire dons a new blue bodice and stomacher. I suspect that the wardrobe team loved this bodice because it appears a lot throughout season 1. I think that this bodice, as opposed to the brown one, looks great in every situation, like interiors, exteriors, broad daylight, and low light. And it's also a nice contrast with the more earthy colors of her skirts. From episode 14 to 16, Claire wears this ensemble pretty much until the end of season 1. Like her velvet bodice, it has detachable sleeves that are spiral laced to the bodice. Here's a rear shot of it. You can see the multiple seams that create the shaping. This bodice is more like a Pierrot jacket because it has no skirt at the front, just this pleated flounce at the back. Here's an example of a late 18th century Pierrot from Christie's auction house. This bodice looks similar, but it's actually a new look. This one I think is cut nearly identical to her brown cassequin bodice that she wore earlier in the season. You can see that from this scene in episode 8 that it has the same pleated peplum in the back. The wool that made the bodice looks like it might have been dyed with woad, which is a natural vegetable dye produced from the leaves of the woad plant seen on the right. Use of this dye goes back to the Vikings. If you look very closely, you'll see the wool actually has a little bit of red in it too. McCall's offers a licensed Outlander pattern of the bodice, skirt, stomacher, and fichu. Cosplayer Kristen Jones used this pattern to make her latest bodice for a Claire cosplay. I would stick to wool or linen to make this bodice if you want to look period correct, because the one from this McCall's creation on the cover looks a little bit synthetic and shiny to me. In episode 4, Claire adds this linen apron and short capelet to the look. Sandy calls this knit item Claire's Hunt Capelet. She says that this knit item is made with, again, bulky yarn, big needles. This is basic knitting and purling. The collar and edging is called seed stitch. I'm probably grasping a bit, but when I saw this capelet, it reminded me of an Elizabethan partlet, although this one pictured here isn't exactly a partlet, which is meant to be worn under the gown. This painting by Dutch-Flemish painter Peter Purbus is from 1551. And she's wearing it again here in episode 5 with a gray woolen shawl. Here is one of Sandy's interpretations. This green one, she says, is being wet blocked after having been knit. It's wet down and pinned to shape on blocking mats and then dried. It has 5 spines where I do decreases. Here's another one of hers in this beautiful mauve color. And here is yet another one in a gray knit wool. In episode 5, in the scene where the women are walking or fulling the wool, Claire swaps out her knits for this fichu. As we've stated before, this was a very commonly worn item in the 18th century. Essentially, it's just a triangular piece of linen that's worn around the neck and then tucked into the bodice. Claire likes to tuck hers in between the lacing of her bodice. Here are two fichus that I have to show you. The Italian lace fichu on the left comes from the Met and dates between the 18th and 19th centuries, while the British fichu on the right is from the V&A and is made of cotton and dates the third quarter of the 18th century. And as we mentioned to you in the previous video, the Calico Acts of 1720-1721 banned the import of most cotton textiles in England as a way to protect a thriving domestic linen industry. The acts were eventually repealed in 1774. You can see that Claire is wearing another set of gray mitts. Here's a pair of British gloves from the Met that Terry Dresbach used for inspiration. These cotton gloves are dated circa 1770. Here's a close-up shot and then a pair by Sandy at Knitsy Blonde. In an image from episode 8, we see a rare shot of Claire's brown knit stockings held in place with a garter. She's also wearing a new pair of front lacing stays. These stays aren't nearly as restrictive or tight as her other stays, which create more of that conical shape. In episode 10, Claire adds this shawl, which according to Sandy, is a very large triangle shawl made from a boucle yarn and has tassels on the 3 points corners. Sandy tells me that boucle yarn is yarn that is spun to look like raw, curly wool. Here are a couple of close-ups of the yarn and a photo of the shawl in the process of Sandy knitting it. Again, bulky yarn, big needles. You can see one of the tassels here. And here. Here's Sandy's version of the shawl with one of the tassels attached. When I mentioned that this shawl looks identical to Claire's in the show, she tells me that it's the same wool as Outlander, saying it's a British sheep wool that comes from the Masham sheep. Sandy showed me these pictures of the Masham sheep, joking that the sheep, especially the one on the right, look like the shawl. In episode 4, Claire wears this new brown tartan bodice and this capelet. Sandy says, I call it the Claire's Castle Cape. But this is actually two pieces. It's a short cape and separate sleeves. I thought it looked like felted wool, similar to Galis's Nuno felted cape, but Sandy says that it's just a finer yarn, a worsted weight, so the knit is tighter. Yes, smaller needles. Here are Sandy's versions of the cape. That's a lighter color, so you can see the stitches better, Sandy says of the cape on the right. In this shot, you can see that the matching knit sleeves are not attached at the bottom. But in this later shot without the cape, the sleeves are attached to the bodice with laces. And that wraps up part 1 of this 2-part episode on the costumes of Claire Fraser. I want to thank both Brenna Barks and Sandy Russo for all of their help. In the next episode, we'll finish up Claire's Season 1 costumes, including her wedding gown. So make sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification icon so you don't miss a thing. And let me know in the comment section below what's your favorite Claire Season 1 costume. And as always, thank you so much for watching.